Guys, we're going to pick it up on page 77 of To Kill a Mockingbird. The first part of this chapter is all about a snowstorm that hits Macomb. This is in South Alabama, and so they don't have any way, like, it's not like Colorado at all. So if it gets really cold, they don't have any way to really get warm except for a few fireplaces. So it snows, and it doesn't even snow an inch. And the kids have never seen snow before, so they get very excited. School gets canceled, and they build a snowman. The snowman comes out looking like a woman and a man, and they call it a hermaphrodite. And it's a humorous part of the story, but we'll skip it for now. But just to give you an idea about how much snow fell, they had to get a wheelbarrow to go around the neighborhood to get enough snow to build the snowman/snowwoman. So that all happens. That night, they have fireplaces that they hardly ever use, but they light them up to try and keep warm because it's cold for like the first time in a long time. So Scout and Jim have this fun day in the snow. They go to sleep, and then Atticus comes in the middle of the night and wakes Scout up. So we're going to pick it up at the bottom of page 77. This is this is Atticus talking. "Baby, get up." Atticus was holding out my bathrobe and coat. "Put your robe on first," he said. Jim was standing beside Atticus, groggy and tousled. He was holding his overcoat closed at his neck, and his other hand was jammed into his pocket. He looked strangely overweight. "Hurry, hun," said Atticus. "Here are your shoes and socks." Stupidly, I put them on. "Is it morning?" "No, it's a little after 1. Hurry now." There was something wrong finally got to me. "What's the matter?" By then, he did not have to tell me, just as birds know where to go when it rains. I knew when there was trouble on our street. Soft, taffeta-like sounds and muffled scurrying sounds filled me with helpless dread. "Whose is it?" "Miss Maudie's, hun," said Atticus gently. At the front door, we saw a huge fire spewing from Miss Maudie's dining room windows. As if to confirm what we saw, the town's fire siren wailed up the scale to a treble pitch and remained there, screaming. "It's gone, ain't it?" moaned Jim. "I expect so," said Atticus. "Now listen, both of you. Go down and stand in front of the Radley place. Keep out of the way. Do you hear? See which way the wind's blowing?" "Oh," said Jim. "Atticus, reckon we ought to start moving the furniture out?" "No, not yet, son. Do as I tell you. Run now. Take Scout with you. You hear? Do not let her out of her sight." Pause there. So, Miss Maudie's house is on fire, and what the town is afraid of is the fire's going to drift over into the other houses and catch them on fire. So that's why Jim says, should we start moving stuff out of the house? Because he wonders if his house, Atticus's house, is going to catch on fire. So Atticus tells Scout and Jim to go stand in front of the Radley place while they try to get the fire out. Middle of page 78. With a push, Atticus started us toward the Radley front gate. We stood watching the street fill with men and cars, while fire silently devoured Miss Maudie's house. "Why don't they hurry? Why don't they hurry?" muttered Jim. We saw why. The old fire truck, killed by the cold, was being pushed from town by a crowd of men. When the men attached the hose to the hydrant, the hose burst and water shot up, tinkling down on the pavement. "Oh, Lord, Jim." Jim put his arm around me. "Hush, Scout," he said. "It ain't time to worry yet. I'll let you know when." The men of Macomb, in all degrees of dress and undress, took furniture from Miss Maudie's house to the yard across the street. I saw Atticus carrying Miss Maudie's heavy oak rocking chair and thought it sensible of him to save what she valued most. Sometimes we heard shouts, and then Mr. Avery's face appeared in the upstairs window. He pushed a mattress out the window and into the street and threw down the furniture until men shouted, "Come down from there, Dick! The stairs are going! Get out of there, Mr. Avery!" Mr. Avery began climbing through the window. "Scouty's stuck," breathed Jim. "Oh, God." Mr. Avery wedged tightly. I buried my head under Jim's arms and didn't look again until Jim cried, "He's got loose, Scout. He's all right." I looked up to see Mr. Avery cross the upstairs porch. He swung his legs over the railing and was sliding down a pillar when he slipped. He fell, yelled, and hit Miss Maudie's shrubbery. Suddenly, I noticed that the men were backing away from Miss Maudie's house, moving down the street towards us. They were no longer carrying furniture. The fire was well into the second floor and had eaten its way to the roof. Window frames were black against the vivid orange center. "Jim, it looks like a pumpkin. Scout, look." Smoke was rolling off our house and Miss Rachel's house like fog off a riverbank, and men were pulling hoses toward them. Behind us, the fire truck from Abbotsville screamed around the curve and stopped in front of our house. "That book," I said. "What?" said Jim. "That Tom Swift book. It ain't mine, it's Dill's." "Don't worry, Scout. It ain't time to worry yet," said Jim. He pointed. "Look yonder." In a group of neighbors, Atticus was standing with his hands in his overcoat pockets. He might have been watching a football game. Miss Maudie was beside him. "See there, he's not worried yet," said Jim. "Why ain't he on top of one of the houses?" "He's too old. He'll break his neck. You think we ought to make him get our stuff out?" "Let's not pester him this time," said Jim. The Abbotsville truck began pumping water onto our house. The man on the roof pointed to places that needed it most. I watched our absolute morphodite, that's their snowman, go black and crumble. Miss Maudie's sun hat settled on top of the heap. Miss Rachel and Miss Maudie's, the men had long ago shed their coats and bathrobes. They worked in pajama tops and nightshirts stuffed into their pants, but I became aware that I was slowly freezing where I stood. Jim tried to keep me warm, but his arm was not enough. I pulled free of it and clutched my shoulders. By dancing a little, I could feel my feet. Another fire truck appeared and stopped in front of Miss Stephanie Crawford's. There was no hydrant for another hose, and the men tried to soak her house with hand extinguishers. Miss Maudie's tin roof quailed the flames. Roaring, the house collapsed. Fire gushed everywhere, followed by a flurry of blankets from men on top of adjacent houses, beating out sparks and burning chunks of wood. It was dawn before the men began to leave, first one by one and then in groups. They pushed the Macomb fire truck back to town. The Abbotsville truck departed, and a third one remained. We found out the next day it had come from Clark's Ferry, 60 miles away. Jim and I slid across the street. Miss Maudie was staring at the black hole in her yard, and Atticus shook his head to tell us that she did not want to talk. He led us home, holding onto our shoulders to cross the icy street. He said to Miss Maudie would stay with Miss Stephanie for the time being. "Anybody want some hot chocolate?" he asked. I shuddered when Atticus started a fire in the kitchen stove. As we drank our cocoa, I noticed Atticus looking at me, at first with curiosity and then with sternness. "I thought I told you and Jim to stay put," he said. "Why, we did. We stayed." "Then whose blanket is that?" "Blanket?" "Yes, ma'am, blanket. It isn't ours." I looked down and found myself clutching a brown wooden blanket I was wearing around my shoulders, squaw fashion. "Atticus, I don't know, sir. I turned to Jim for an answer, but Jim was even more bewildered than I. He said he didn't know how it got there. We did exactly as Atticus had told us. We stood down by the Radley gate, away from everybody. We didn't move an inch." Jim stopped. "Mr. Nathan was at the fire," he babbled. I saw him. He was tugging that mattress. Atticus, I swear." "That's all right, son," Atticus grinned slowly. "Looks like all of Macomb was out tonight in one way or another. Jim, there's some wrapping paper in the pantry. I think, well, go get it and we'll..." "Atticus, no, sir." Jim seemed to have lost his mind. He began pouring out our secrets right and left in total disregard for my safety, if not for his own. Omitting nothing, not whole, pants and all. "And then Mr. Nathan put cement in that tree, Atticus, and he did it to stop us finding things. He's crazy, I reckon, like they say, but Atticus, I swear to God, he ain't ever harmed us. He ain't ever hurt us. He could have cut my throat from ear to ear that night, but he tried to mend my pants instead. He ain't even heard us, Atticus. Atticus said, "Whoa, son," so gently I was greatly heartened. It was obvious that he had not followed a word Jim said, for all Atticus said was, "You're right. We better keep this and the blanket to ourselves. Someday, maybe, Scout can thank him for covering her up." "Thank who?" I asked. "Boo Radley. You were so busy looking at the fire you didn't even know who put the blanket around you." My stomach turned to water, and I nearly threw up when Jim held out the blanket and crept toward me. He sneaked out of the house and turned around, and he sneaked up and went like this. Atticus said dryly, "Do not let this inspire you to further glory, Jeremy." Jim scowled. "I ain't going to do anything to him." But I watched the spark of fresh adventure leave his eyes. "Just think, Scout," he said, "if you just would have turned around, you would have seen him." Calpurnius woke us up at noon. Atticus had said we need not go to school that day, for we would learn nothing after no sleep. Calpurnius said for us to try and clean up the front yard. Miss Maudie's sun hat was suspended in a thin layer of ice like a fly in amber, and we had to dig underneath the dirt for her hedge clippers. We found her in her backyard, gazing at her frozen, charred azaleas. "We're bringing back your things, Miss Maudie," said Jim. "We're awful sorry." Miss Maudie looked around at the shadow of her old, grin face. "Well, I always wanted a smaller house, Jim Finch. Gives us me more yard, and just think, I'll have more room for my flowers now." "You ain't grieving, Miss Maudie?" I asked, surprised. Atticus said her house was nearly all she had. "Grieving, child? Well, I hated that old cow barn. Thought of setting fire to it 100 times myself, except they'd lock me up. But don't you worry about me, Jean Louise Finch. There are ways of doing things you don't know about. Well, I'll build me a little house, and I'll take in a couple of renters, and, well, gracious, I'll have the finest yard in Alabama. Those belling grass will look plain puny when I get started." Jim and I looked at each other. "Well, how'd it catch, Miss Maudie?" he asked. "I don't know, Jim. Probably the flue in the kitchen. I kept a fire in there last night for my potted plants. Hear you had some unexpected company last night, Miss Jean Louise." "How'd you know?" "Atticus told me on his way to town this morning. Tell you the truth, I'd like to have been with you, and I'd have the sense to turn around, too." Miss Maudie puzzled me. With most of her possessions gone and her beloved yard in shambles, she still looked lively and cordial interest in Jim and my affairs. She must have seen my perplexity. She said, "Only thing I worried about last night was all the danger and commotion it caused. This whole neighborhood could have gone up in flames. Mr. Avery will be in bed for a week. He's right stove up. He's too old to do things like that, and I told him so. As soon as I can get my hands clean, and when Miss Stephanie Crawford's not looking, I'll make him a lean cake. That Stephanie's been after my recipe for 30 years, and if she thinks I'll give it to her just because I'm staying with her, she's got another thing coming." I reflected that if Miss Maudie broke down and gave it to her, Miss Stephanie couldn't follow it anyway. Miss Maudie had once let me see it. Among other things, the recipe called for 1 large cup of sugar. It was a still day, and the air was so cold and clear, we could hear the courthouse clock clank and rattle and strain before it struck the hour. Miss Maudie's nose was a color I'd never seen it before, and I inquired about it. "Why, I've been out here since 6 o'clock, she said. "Should be frozen by now." She held up her hands. A network of tiny lines crisscrossed her palms and brown with dirt and dried blood. "You've ruined them," said Jim. "Why don't you get a colored man?" There was no note of sacrifice in his voice when he added, "Or Scout and me, we can help you." "Thank you, sir, but you've got a job of your own over there." She pointed to our yard. "You mean our Morford?" I asked. "Shoot, we can rake him up in a jiffy." Miss Maudie stared down at me, her lips moving silently. Suddenly, she put her hands to her head and whooped. Means she was laughing. When we left, she was still chuckling. Jim said he didn't know what was the matter with her. That was just Miss Maudie. Okay, so here's what you're going to do next. Now that you're done reading, you're going to go to... I want you to go to Google Docs. So open up your Google Docs. And we're going to go to this template gallery up here. And we're going to look for I'm going to have to scroll a little bit to find it. Oh my goodness. Oh, newsletter. Here we go. A newsletter. So I want you to find one of these newsletter templates. And I think there's more than this in there somewhere, but if you only have these three, you can just pick one. So I'm going to do, maybe I'll do this. I'll do this one. And it doesn't matter what template you choose. Okay, so what you're going to pretend is that you are a newspaper reporter, and you're going to report on this paper. On this hot fire that Miss Maudie had. So the very first thing you need to do is come up with the name of your newspaper. So it could be anything. Macomb Times. It could be Alabama News, or who knows, but some kind of name for your newspaper. And you can do that here and here. Now I want you to do the date. I believe it tells us at the beginning of chapter 8, I think this is November, I'm pretty sure-ish. But it's 1930 or whatever. So you can just kind of make up a date somewhere in there around November 1935 or whatever. I don't know. Something along those lines. And then you need to come up with a headline. So local woman's house burns down or whatever. You need to find a picture that you can cut and paste here. And you can get those from Google Images. And then I want at least a 2-page story, news story. And you're going to start typing that right here. So you'll delete this stuff and you'll start typing your news story. I want you to pretend you're a reporter. So you're going to give me the 5 W's. Who, when, where, what, and why. And we have all those things answered inside this chapter. So it's Miss Maudie's house is burned down. And we find out why they're in the chapter, and you can go back and find that. And then I also want you to come up with some quotes. So a good news reporter would ask some different people quotes. Now, some of these you'll have to make up. So you could ask Mr. Avery what he thought, or you could ask Atticus or anyone else there at the fire about what they thought. You should include major events, such as how the town showed up and helped and the different things they did. And you want to be specific about that. And then, so you'll do most of your story up here on the top. Of course, you're going to say by your name, not by your name, obviously not this person's name. And then just make sure and save it, and you can share it with me, or I'll have a turn-in on Schoology. Miss Gray, as I told you yesterday, is a retired English teacher, and so she also can help you with this assignment. This is due on Monday, along with your book project, so make sure you have your book project complete also. Okay, so be nice to the sub.